A doctored glass, a camera click, and a village nanny wakes in the general's son's bed, then runs before the house can decide her fate. On the border train, a heartbeat follows. In South City, she hides behind a blue gate and a noodle pot that won't stop boiling. Midnight. A brick blooms through glass and a burned-faced watcher doesn't blink. Power tightens, whispers turn to knives, a tribunal seal thuds red. Choose, Grace, silence that scorches you, or truth that burns them. Tires hiss on wet stone. A soldier steps from the dark. A chestnut dog with one ragged ear growls. The city holds its breath. The compound rose from the city like a private country inside a crest of walls, its avenues as straight as commands, its plane trees cut to soldierly symmetry, its brass plaques winking under a permanent polish that smelled faintly of oil and old metals. Beyond the guarded gates, the world was noise and barter, but inside, power moved quietly, carried on murmured surnames. Lark, Truong, Chu, spoken with the care of handling porcelain, and every morning the bugle stitched a seam of sound through courtyards where wives in tailored wool and children in crisp uniforms crossed the stone with purpose, and drivers stood by black sedans whose paintwork held the sky like a sheet of ink. It was into this clockwork Grace Mung stepped, with a suitcase the color of dust and two patched dresses folded around a tin of herbal tea for her mother and a photograph no larger than a palm, a village child with a mooncake grin pressed between parents who had not yet learned the arithmetic of hunger. She was 22 and small-boned in a way that made crowded spaces find room for her, hair the plain dark of wet earth clipped at the nape to keep it from the stove, a face fine and even as if drawn with a single brushstroke, brows soft, mouth honest, eyes that looked and then lowered as if trained by seasons of harvest to accept sun, frost, and whatever came next. Her hands were her biography. Knuckles shiny with work, nails clipped near to nothing, the faint pad of heat in her palms that makes soup taste like a home. So when the steward of the Lark household asked if she knew how to handle a child in a kitchen, she answered with a nod and the steadying breath of someone who has crossed a long bridge over deep water and discovered her feet still willing. The Lark residence was a villa tucked into a crook of the compound's inner road, a studied geometry of privilege, veranda columns like standing officers, eaves that fell in generous shadows, a garden raked into a quiet poem of gravel and pine. Inside, the parquet floors shone with a firelight gloss, and the air wore a blend of sandalwood and the faint ghost of gun oil that clung to uniforms no matter how often they were brushed. The family portraits told the story without needing words. Commander Lark in dress grays, shoulders like a gate, a square jaw weathered into the nobility of decisions. Beside him, Mrs. Lark, elegance personified, a woman whose silk chose her and not the other way around, cheekbones lifted like clipped wings, pearls obedient, around a throat that had learned to carry equal parts tenderness and decree. Between them, in one frame, slightly away as if the painter had been warned that distance was a son's natural armor, Logan Lark at 27, every line an argument for destiny, tall to the point of rumor, 6'1" at least, built with the economy that training gives, a posture that made ceilings feel lower, hair clipped close to disciplined waves, temples already flinting toward a future. Streak of steel, the sort of face that made people sit a fraction straighter when he entered the room, even if they didn't know why. Eyes the color of a winter river when the sun goes thin, a mouth that did not waste itself on easy smiles. Commendations bracketed his career in gleaming ribbons, and there was a photograph in a side room. Logan in fatigues, sand in the creases of his knuckles, a boy on his hip gripping his collar with worshipful hands. That explained why people in the compound said his name as if it were an appointment. Veronica Truong floated in and out of that house like an heirloom scent, her white coat a flag of belonging. She wore wealth like a second skin, the particular ease of old money that made the expensive invisible, cashmere that looked like fog, shoes whose leather shone with the kind of softness only patience can afford, a watch slim as a promise, tall and swan-necked, lips always hydrated into a decision, hair the lacquered black of a grand piano brushed to one shoulder with indifference. Her beauty was the sort a mirror obeys, all angles resolved, and she spoke with the authority of someone who had learned early that hospitals and family trees share a similar architecture, corridors where the uninvited get lost. On the evening the accident of Grace's life was arranged, the compound had the breathless stillness of a theater before curtain. There had been a small celebration for a returning unit, and the Lark House, out of habit or hospitality, had opened its doors to a few ranking officers and their wives, Crystal doing its thin singing, wine the dark red of good intentions, and Grace had moved through rooms with her soft-footed competence. A tray here, a hand towel there, the invisible choreography of service, while Veronica's laughter lay across the furniture like a silk shawl. If a stranger had watched closely, they would have seen that the wine Grace carried to the sideboard was not poured where the guests could see, that the decanter was briefly eclipsed by Veronica's sleeve, that when Grace, who rarely touched anything stronger than tea, brought a glass to her lips to be polite at the coaxing of a junior officer's wife, the taste carried a floral sweetness that did not belong to grapes, that later, when her knees misread the language of the floor and the coolness of the corridor wall, felt as necessary as air. Veronica's hand was there, not to steady but to redirect, her voice a lullaby of instructions. "The guest room on the left, dear. The lights are out. Sleep it off." Grace would remember, if remember is the word for impressions that stick to the mind like pollen. The smell first, starch and cedar, and the weight of a blanket falling, and then a presence in the dim, the electric nearness of another person, a breath that found her name without knowing it, a confusion that tried to write itself into refusal, and then the tide of a drug pulling all the lines from the drawing. To say, she slept would be to grant consent to oblivion she did not choose, so better to say that when morning rolled out, its thin cloth of light, she woke inside a bed that had a memory of someone else. Sheets pulled, a warmth at the shoulder where the ghost of a head had been. The mirror in the guest room told a story she could not swallow, a neck patterned with the faintest proof of mouths, a wrist bruise like a thumbprint, a mouth full and unused to this shape, and she gathered herself with a trembling haste that made her clumsy. Buttons wronged their holes, hairpins bit her fingers, the floor had opinions, and when she opened the door, Veronica was leaning against the jamb with a camera in her hand as if waiting for a sunrise. The shutter blinked once, click, like a judge's pen, and Veronica smiled the way a cat smiles when the bird flutters between pane and sky. "Don't be frightened," she said, tongue touching the consonants as if tasting them for sweetness. "I chose the dosage myself. I chose the door, too. If you must know, Logan did not know until he could not know otherwise. You should feel honored. Do you know how many women in this place would eat their rings for an evening with him?" Grace's eyes, wide and aching, found Veronica's face and could not solve it. The world of the compound had been a map she was learning line by line, but now the compass spun. "Why?" she asked, and the question was as old as jealousy and as young as this hour. Veronica's laugh was winter sunlight on cut glass. "Because even God statues need a squall to test their balance. Because the larks have enjoyed the unbroken habit of triumph for so long that they have forgotten to bow. Because my family stitched this place's veins as well as theirs, and I prefer the needle in my hand. Because if a stain is placed just so, the eye travels there first, forever." Grace did not cry. There is a kind of shock that dries a person from the inside. But when Veronica stepped closer, she could smell a perfume that cost a week of wages in a village and realize, with the sudden clarity of pain, that there were worlds, separated by tissue, rather than distance. Days became a calendar of nausea, and one morning at dawn, shoulders hunched over a basin of river fish, the smell rose like a fist, and she retched until her ribs complained. When she lifted her head, eyes wet and ringed with fatigue, Veronica was there in the back doorway, watching like a goddess at the edge of mortal chores. The corner of her mouth lifted. "Pregnant, are you?" "Logan's?" She did not wait for Grace to answer before taking the girl's chin between two fingers that felt as cold as coins. "Make it loud. Make it filthy. Then take your money and disappear." Money fell from a small calfskin purse with a sound like a slap. Some of it touched Grace's cheek. Not hard, but the insult was in the arithmetic, and Veronica added, as if reciting a prescription, "My hospital, my surgeon, your mother's treatment, train tickets, a little house, sheep if you like such creatures, one loud scandal to purchase the rest." Grace gathered the bills because paper can be a lifeline when the river runs fast, because a mother's cough is the tyrant of a daughter's nights, because poverty teaches a person to take the step available and pray the bridge appears afterward. That evening, the house erupted. The kind of quiet explosion wealth prefers. Doors closed firmly, voices held low but iron in them, footsteps weighted with the grammar of authority, and Commander Lark stood in his study with a riding crop across his palm, a relic of strictness, eyes gray like a decision made. Logan faced him with the calm that comes from spending hours at the edge of danger and learning not to blink, and the commander asked one question in a voice that made the glasses on the sideboard hold their breath. "Is it true?" He did not strike immediately. Discipline is a ceremony in such families, and the first blow is always a christening of a principle, not a punishment of a man. The leather found Logan's shoulder with a sound that made Grace, summoned to witness like a fault in the wiring of fate, flinch and then step between the two men with the reflex of someone who has never been allowed to protect anything and cannot bear to miss the chance. She took the next stroke along the slope of her back and felt it open like a red door inside her breath. The commander's eyes that had seen battlefields and half-broken suns narrowed at that, not because he had struck a girl, he had never yet allowed himself that failure, but because she had chosen to receive what was not hers. And he heard, through the tempo of his anger, the thin silver thread of her voice. "Sir, it is my doing, my fault, punish me." Mrs. Lark, who had listened with a constellation of emotions mapping themselves across her face, love for a son, shame for a rumor, betrayal for a future she had curated with the delicacy of a bonsai, clutched Veronica as if the girl were a certificate of someone else's virtue. Her words were soft, but the edges were steel. "We have arranged this match for 20 years, darling. 20. And now, a servant." The word hung like smoke. Logan's mouth opened to speak, but he saw Grace's fear, and he closed it again, replaced protest with action. Later, in the silence that follows storms, he found her at the kitchen door and pressed a thick envelope into her hands, his voice low, as if the walls themselves reported to his father. "Take it and go home. End it. This child cannot stand in the teeth of this place. Hide until it is done. I won't say you climbed anyone's bed to climb a ladder. I won't say it because I do not believe it." His eyes, river dark, held hers for the length of a vow he could not make. She left under a sky that had not yet learned the day, the compound's gate yawning open on a road that felt like a sentence. The train took her in the way machines take the lost, indifferent and on time. And her father met her at the village with a face already oiled by the prospect of her earnings, a bicycle leaning against the gate as if ready to elope with someone else's future. He had the impatience of a man who has found a shortcut that belongs to someone else, and when he saw the envelope, his eyes swelled with the heat of sudden plans. Grace, who had learned the grammar of the compound and found it unforgiving, borrowed a page from it now. She stood straighter than he remembered, a hand on her belly like a seal, and said in a tone that cut through his greed and found the small boy still hiding inside the man. "If you touch a single note meant for mother's cure, I will end this grandchild you think to boast of, and you will have purchased your shame with nothing." He laughed first, then believed her second, and the hospital received her mother because fear can be persuaded to generosity when it smells the possibility of a future in uniform. Doctors who live by the algebra of body and chance told Grace the truth she needed to hear. The illness was not a cliff but a slope. Rest would be as curative as medicine. Fields and river buckets must become stories, not chores. She did not stay to be right or wrong about her father's capacity for kindness. She took her mother and what remained of the money and rode west because west was where the trains ran until they ran out of map and arrived at a border town where mountains held the horizon like elders, leaning on canes, and the air tasted of cumin and diesel and weather that had learned to change its mind quickly. She bought a small house the size of courage and a stove that glowed like a patient heart, and with 2 sacks of rice noodles and a broth, learned from the Lark kitchen and perfected by the memory of her village, she opened a stall that stitched noon to evening with steam. She told the neighbors only what would keep them kind. that her husband had died, that the woman in her courtyard was her mother-in-law, that she wished only to cook and be left to the arithmetic of onions and debt. They were generous in the way border people often are, accustomed to arrivals, fluent in loss, and they praised the chew of her noodles and the way her scallions met the sesame like a handshake, and some days her belly felt like a moon. The tide was fond of pulling, and she spoke to it under her breath, not with promises, but with the plain speech of the poor. Stay, grow, forgive me. The town changed in a week, the way a room changes when a door is opened and soldiers walk through it, and convoys began to thread the main road, men in uniforms the color of quiet moving with the economy of rehearsed urgency. The stall grew a new kind of customer, boots scuffing the threshold, jokes left unfinished, maps folded and unfolded until their creases learned the names of hills. One afternoon a shadow fell across her doorway that did not belong to weather, and when she lifted her head from the tray of greens, she found herself looking into the worn handsomeness of a man who looked like the portrait in the Lark hallway after a hard season, leaner by something that was not hunger, eyes weathered by distances, mouth that had mislaid its inclination to soften. Logan Lark's gaze dropped, inevitably helplessly, to the round architecture of her belly and stuck there, then jerked back to her face with the bewildered hope of someone watching a door open where a wall used to be. "You didn't," he said, and the words were too small for the shock inside them. "You kept him." She did not know how to answer, except by saying the truest thing that would not undress her soul in public, that a tiny fist had once pressed itself to her palm from the inside and signed a contract there, that in the darkest hour of a long train she had felt a kick like a drum and heard it say, "Live," that he was the one, pure thread tying her to a man she had been taught to release like a saint. Her mother, who had not yet learned the etiquette of forgiving soldiers, appeared with a rolling pin held like a scepter and chased Logan half a street before the universe intervened with a splash of water at Grace's ankles and a contraction that bent her in half. Logan ran the way men at the edge of danger run when danger changes address, scooped her as if she were nothing and everything, and the hospital took them. And the boy arrived into a world that had been arguing about him since he existed as an idea, 7.5 pounds of noisy conclusion, hair already set in the obstinate whirl of his father's, mouth forming practice vows to milk and breath, eyes that would eventually decide which family they resembled. They named him Evan in the quiet after the storm, and he tasted the air as if evaluating whether to stay. Logan's apology, when it came, did not dress itself in poetry. He knelt in front of Grace's mother with the unshowy humility of a man used to giving orders and said that he had to return to the front, that he had set numbers in a notebook, home, duty room, unit, that were doors she could open at any hour, that there was a house in South City which did not care whether she accepted the compound's embrace, that the key would arrive, that if the war took his name off his body, everything in his safe had already chosen Grace and Evan. Then dawn peeled the night away, and he was gone, the bed remembering his weight, and the room holding the outline of his absence like a chalk drawing. And there, at that hinge between departure and whatever came next, Grace discovered that the story of power, when it touches the story of the poor, is not a straight line but a braid, one strand money, one duty, one love. And she wrapped it around her wrist like a talisman, standing in the doorway of her stall while steam rose like prayer, the mountains watching as if they had seen this, seen across centuries, the girl, the child, the man on a road, and knew how the wind would temper them all. The rain settled over the border town like a shawl and then moved inland, drawn by rails and rumor, and in their wake arrived a driver in a black sedan and a woman who carried her authority the way other people carry umbrellas, without thinking about it until weather insists, Mrs. Lark in a cream coat that refused mud and a navy dress whose hem respected geometry, pearls quiet at her throat, hair composed into an architecture that suggested the day would go as she intended. Beside her stood the driver, a man named Han Mercer, late 30s, rangy in the way of men who have learned the distances of roads by foot as well as by engine, a thin scar running from the corner of his jaw to the notch of his collar like a misplaced comma, his mustache a tidy bar that softened an otherwise foxish face, eyes watchful but not unkind, the posture of someone who has guarded gates and secrets and knows they are the same work. He lifted the trunk as if it were made of narrative rather than wood and leather, and when Mrs. Lark crossed the damp yard of Grace's small house with that particular blend of careful steps and decisive purpose unique to women who have directed kitchens and crisis alike, it was to find Grace by the stove with Evan asleep on her chest and steam writing its own language around them, the older woman's gaze softening not by surrender but choice, the way a general might take off his cap to address a child. She asked for water, praised the broth, and then, as if the conversation were a table requiring setting, she laid out the plates of her intent. Registration, household papers, a school one day that would look at Evan and recognize in his name both history and possibility. She did not press the compound, only the city, and when Grace's mother appeared in the doorway with her hands still flour-dusted from dumplings and her hair caught in a scarf patterned with small faded flowers, Mrs. Lark reached for those hands first, as if the elder blessing were a ladder she wished to stand upon before any other thing. The plan the rain drew across their heads was simple. The notebook of numbers Logan had left would be honored. Commissar Chu's office would be called to grease the small wheels that grind families into legal shapes, and a key to a grandmother's house in South City would be fetched by an adjutant so precise he polished his shoelaces. The next morning, the sedan took them to the station, Han Mercer moving through Porter's with the smile of a man who understands the only power worth having is the kind that uses itself to make other people's burdens lighter, and the train accepted them with the yawn of an old animal. Compartments teach strangers each other quickly. Across from Grace sat a woman in her early 30s with an angular elegance and a tired bravado, Sarah Whitlow, tall enough to reach the upper berth without a hop, all elbow and cheekbone in a comely way, ash-brown hair braided and tied with a shoelace, because life had taught her the transaction between beauty and time, skin winter pale under summer freckles, as if two seasons had argued, and both won. She wore a blue cardigan gone at the elbows, a skirt that had learned to forgive knees, and she smelled faintly of printer's ink and clove cigarettes. She dealt in second-hand books and tea infusions on a tray strapped to a bicycle. A business built out of folding tables and stubbornness after a dock accident took the husband she had not had time to stop resenting for drinking, but did not stop loving once grief took a seat. Her humor was dry as a good biscuit, the sort that dissolves only when you want it to, and she had the habit of describing people in metaphors that made them more seen than they had felt in years. She looked at Evan, made a face of mock awe as if he were an emperor incognito, and then, finding Grace's guard made of poverty rather than pride, offered half her orange and a promise. If the city was unkind, she knew corners that weren't. Near the carriage door, a conscript named Felix Tran leaned against the corridor window with the haunted nonchalance of men who joke so their hands don't shake, a slim, wiry boy with a buzz cut and a smile one size too large for his face, a fresh scar in his eyebrow like a misplaced tilde, the smell of boot polish and laundry powder rising off his uniform. He spoke to Evan in a mock-serious voice about tanks and dragons, and Evan gurgled a reply that convinced them both he approved. When the city announced itself, it did so with wet stone and trolley bells, and a sky the color of diluted ink, South City a coastline of neon and tradition, alleys that bent like elbows and boulevards that behaved like mirrors, and the grandmother's house waited at the end of a lane that smelled of soy and rain, low wall, blue gate, peeling toward charm, a courtyard with a persimmon tree listing aesthetically to one side as if it had once been posed by a painter and never quite returned to nature. The adjutant who met them with the key was named Bao Lin, 26 and exacting, a neat man with a narrow face and a tie that thought too much of itself, hair parted as if by protractor, the kind of clerk soldiers distrust until they need someone who can find a form that does not wish to be found. His mustache was an anxious afterthought, a few hairs determined to assemble into authority, his hands long-fingered and gentle when he handed the key to Grace, and his voice a soft rasp that hinted at childhood asthma and adult decorum. Papers were shuttled, dates were stamped. The house relinquished its dust with the sigh of a place relieved to be useful again, and the neighborhoods curiously staged its welcome the way neighborhoods do by sending its appointed representatives. First a cat, slate gray and appraising, the tip of its tail missing like a story it refused to tell, eyes the yellow of late afternoon, thin as dignity will allow, who circled the courtyard with the confidence of a former owner reclaiming rights, then leaped onto the windowsill and installed itself as if a tenancy had been renewed. Evan reached, the cat considered, then allowed 2 fingers upon its back, and thus the contract was signed. He would be permitted to pet, but never to claim, and in return, the cat would accept the name Ink and adopt the generous habit of sleeping in the baby's cradle when the baby was not there, as if keeping the place warm for his return. A dog announced himself days later by failing to bark at the proper time. He had the look of a mongrel prince, mid-sized and long-backed, a chestnut coat that had once perhaps been brushed by someone who owned a brush, a white blaze down his face like a painter's impatient stripe, ears uneven, one ragged as a battle flag, one neat as a new recruit, eyes the liquid brown of good tea, and he hovered at the mouth of the lane with the particular mix of hope and self-protection familiar to orphans. Evan, who by now had learned that not all things come when you call, but some do when you offer, held out a dumpling with both hands, and the dog, after performing the dance of suspicion 3 times, approached sideways and accepted delicately, then sat with the solemnity of a boy waiting to be told his new name. Grace called him Button because he seemed made to fasten things that might otherwise fly apart, and he accepted the title with a tail thump that said he had known worse and would try to live up to better. South City is a maw and a cradle, and it tests new residents with cues and signatures. The licensing office for small food businesses had a round woman at its center like a planet with rings of paper around her. Amelia Lynn, a clerk in her early 40s, whose body had become comfortable with its own gravity. Bob haircut that refused fashion in favor of good sense, round glasses, magnifying eyes that saw both fraud and fatigue and knew how to ease the latter without being fooled by the former. Her blouse was stiff with starch and determination, and she spoke in a tempo that permitted no misunderstanding, syllables aligned like soldiers on parade. She asked Grace about hand-washing stations, supply chain sources, disposal methods, and when Grace's answers were practical but rural, Amelia rearranged her expectations with a sigh that ranked somewhere between exasperation and affection, retrieved a sample application thick as a novella, circled sections like a teacher, and said if Grace brought the proper stamps tomorrow, she would see what she could do after lunch, which, by coincidence, would be an excellent time to bring a bowl of those noodles everyone keeps whispering about in the hallway. A neighbor materialized that afternoon at the courtyard wall to offer unsolicited advice. The cornerstone of urban kindness, Madame Chow, late 50s and professionally polished, hair in a helmet of lacquered black that reflected the sky in comedic miniature, lips rouged into an optimistic bow, a dozen gold bangles singing softly on a wrist trained to lift only porcelain, a wide lapel blouse printed with gardenias and confidence. She declared she had once supplied half the tea shops in the district with scallions until scandal tore apart her third marriage, something about a dance instructor and a lottery ticket, and now began every sentence with, "In this city, what you must learn is," before dispensing a paragraph of tactical gossip that, cut thin, was useful, like ginger. She sketched the map of suppliers who would not water the broth with promises, pointed at the butcher whose cleaver claimed not just meat, but reputations, mentioned a market inspector with a fondness for envelopes and for believing he didn't have one, and finished with the warning that men in uniform have sisters, as well as mothers, and both are often more dangerous than the men. The first visit from the Lark elders occurred not with brass, but with groceries, the commander arriving in plain clothes that failed to look plain on him, shoulders refusing to be diminished even by a cardigan, his jaw clean-shaven into an equation that history solved with medals. He held Evan with the awkward care of a man who could field-strip a pistol blindfolded, but feared the weight of a 6-month-old might explode into tears. And when the child seized the commander's ear as if to test its resilience, something like laughter fractured the older man's reserve, a sound like a door opening onto a garden he had forgotten he owned. Mrs. Lark supervised without seeming to, smoothing a blanket, repositioning a cushion, permitting herself the briefest touch to Grace's cheek in a gesture that said both apology and welcome, then stepping back to ask about ventilation and signage and prices with the seriousness of a partner rather than a patron. She confessed to a secret jealousy of women who cook well, compared the shine of Grace's bowls to a memory of a street vendor in a town that no longer exists, and then warned, gently, but with the steel that makes warnings worth listening to, that while the city would love a mother who toils and a baby who smiles, there would be those who find in other people's lives a mirror for their failures and attempt to crack it. The crack was tested days later when a market inspector named Duan arrived with a ledger whose columns had learned to make room for bribes, a man in his early 50s with a square face that nature had planted a sapling mustache upon that never quite matured, the posture of a one-time athlete who had traded sprinting for sitting in chairs of increasing importance, a belly like a satisfied punctuation mark under a shirt that had surrendered to his ambitions. He declared that Grace's shop required a food safety certificate she had not yet obtained, and which, he regretted to inform, took months except when it did not, hinted at Taylor's hungrier-than-firing squads, and proposed a solution that could be arranged with a handshake no one would see. Grace, who had not spent time behind the Lark gates for nothing, stood with her shoulders exactly the way Mrs. Lark held hers, in arguments, and said that Amelia Lynn, at the licensing office, had approved a provisional opening, that a Mrs. Chow had indicated it was so, that the inspector was welcome to a bowl of noodles if he was hungry, but that she preferred to pay fees with receipts and gratitude with food. The man blinked at being told his own appetite was different from his authorities, and before he could reconfigure his methods, the sound of a sedan announced an arrival he considered legendary enough to justify a retreat. Mrs. Lark stepping from the car in a raincoat the color of slate, an umbrella that preferred drizzle to downpour, and a voice that could write letters to superiors even while speaking. Inspector Duan, I trust your daughter's examination went well. I had a word with Principal Luo. She admires your child's essays. Flattery rearranged the inspector's spine into a more honest curve. His mustache seemed to stand at attention, and he accepted a bowl of noodles with the air of a man who has been gently told his power has been inspected and found wanting. On the first night the signboard swung in the alley wind, Grace wrote the menu in a cramped hand that still belonged to the girl who had once copied multiplication tables by lamplight, rice noodles with broth, rice noodles with braised beef if obtainable, scallion pancakes when the oil was generous, soy milk in the mornings when Button watched the mill with reverence as if it were a sacred engine, and Sarah Whitlow arrived not to eat but to help, rolling up her sleeves to wipe tables with the proprietary briskness of a friend who had decided to be one, teasing ink out from under a stool with a string that had previously belonged to a book bundle, and telling a story about a poet who traded a rhyme for a lunch and then begged to be paid in dumplings instead because rhyme is its own hunger. Felix Tran appeared on a weekend pass, clean, apologetic, the city's noise written in his posture, and stood by the door as if guarding the broth, sharing quiet jokes with Button, who answered with tail thumps that contained a grammar of acceptance. Felix admitted he had joined to lighten his mother's rent, and because the recruiter's speech had made the future sound like a medal, then looked at Evan with the expression of someone who had once been held and could not recall when. The city's habits began to braid themselves around Grace's days, a fruit vendor with a laugh like a bus, breaking hard who smuggled 2 extra apples into Evan's pram because babies, a shoeshine boy whose left eye turned in at a hopeful angle and who polished Grace's one good pair of flats as if they were a brass plaque commemorating something worth remembering, an auntie with strong shoulders and a voice like boiled sugar who taught Grace to bargain in, the market without apologizing afterward, and a pediatrician at the clinic named Doctor. Sanjay Mehra, whose salt and pepper beard and gentle eyes made every waiting room feel less like a verdict and more like a room where someone would find the light switch. Mehra was in his mid-40s, tall but unthreatening, angular in the way of men who have carved themselves down to function, hands as deft with a stethoscope as they were with a paper crane he would fold for a terrified child and leave in a pocket like a spell. And when Evan woke one night on fire with fever and Grace's lungs forgot their job, it was Mayra who placed a cool hand on the boy's chest and said in a voice calibrated to the decibel of panic, "We will bring him down," teaching Grace how baths become medicine and windows become allies, explaining how bodies are weather and how to recognize storms that pass from those that must be negotiated. Letters from the front arrived when they managed to find the right address, the envelopes sand-dusted as if the geography they had crossed refused to be forgotten. Logan's handwriting looked like his gait, economical, counting ground with neat strides, and he wrote not the things that would injure a woman's sleep, but enough to make her feel that the silence between them was not neglect, but occupation, a labor necessary for the bridge they hoped to cross. He had seen hills move under mirage. He had taught boys to wrap feet properly. He had a scar that behaved in rain like a barometer. He dreamed of broth. In one letter, a pressed wildflower arrived, brittle and purple, as if the field had compressed its hope into a small offering, and Grace hid it in a copy of a cheap romance Sarah had insisted she borrow, the cover peeling, the heroine a redhead with a sailor to kiss, because love preserved leaf and paper both, and that felt like an economy she could trust. Household registration is a ritual with incense and signatures, and it was Commissar Chu himself who eventually stood at the low blue gate, a man in his 60s with a face that had learned to be kind because it had spent decades being stern, a head of hair that had refused to retreat as a personal motto, eyes that could still do arithmetic at distance and in wind, his uniform making the courtyard feel suddenly like a stage. He congratulated Grace on the shop, asked with gentle mischief whether the cat had paid its taxes, accepted tea, and then, with Amelia Lynn's perfectly squared papers in a folder on his arm, read aloud what the city now admitted. Evan's name, the address, the sealed stamp whose ink believed itself imperial, and Grace felt something interior loosen, like a knot being taught a better way to hold. Mrs. Lark squeezed her forearm with the kind of maternal pride that made even the courtyard walls stand taller, and Button performed a lap of honor that culminated in swallowing a fly and looking pleased by the versatility of celebration. It would have been enough to end the day there. But cities extract their dues in surprises, and the last of the light had scarcely finished gilding the persimmon leaves when a man appeared across the lane who did not belong to anything except himself. Hat brim nailed low, suit too good for the hour and too old for the season, the right side of his face lined with the invisible handwriting of a burn, acquired long enough ago that the pain had taught the man to regard the world sideways. His beard was a close black frost around a mouth that offered no preview of its sentences, and his hands were tucked into his coat pockets in that way that makes people guess at the shapes hidden there, a calculation slipping behind him like a dog, given orders in a language Grace did not speak. He looked toward the gate as if measuring it, toward the signboard as if translating it, and then when Button's ears lifted and Ink's tail became a question mark, the man smiled an absent, unreadable smile and walked on, not fast, not slow, like a tide that never misses an appointment. Sarah, arriving with a bag of books tied in twine, watched him go and said nothing, which is a kind of warning more eloquent than speech. That night, Grace folded 7 paper cranes from the pages of a calendar that had incorrectly predicted rain and hung them above Evan's crib with thread Button had tried to chew twice, and in the slowness after midnight she considered the ledger of the day, the stamp on a paper that wrote her son into a city, the recipe that had fed a dozen strangers into sighing, the inspector's mustache that now remembered humility, the dog settling against the threshold, neither inside nor out, as if guarding the line itself. She did not pray for miracles, only for the mathematics to continue working, broth to bowls, sleep to mornings, letters to hands, and when the wind through the persimmon leaves made the sound of a man returning down a lane, she did not indulge the fantasy, though she allowed herself the extravagance of hope, which is the one luxury the poor can afford without debt. Summer arrived in South City not as a season but as a temperament, heat rising from the cobbles until the air itself seemed to breathe, and Grace learned to set the pots to a lower simmer so the broth would not bully the noodles. The courtyard persimmon put its energies into small green lanterns that promised an autumn sweetness. Ink appropriated the shadiest windowsill like a philosopher choosing the best light for thinking, and Button, whose chestnut coat now shone with a health that made him look as if someone had varnished his ribs, slept exactly where the door met the street so his body could be a hinge between home and world. The shop's signboard, hand-lettered and imperfect, squeaked in the afternoon wind like a child practicing a new word, and people came not because hunger is rare in a city, but because honest comfort is, and Grace's bowls were a kind of grammar even the exhausted could read. Mrs. Lark visited with increasing regularity, sometimes alone, sometimes with Commander Lark, whose attempt to look anonymous always failed in the way mountains fail at pretending to be furniture, and with each visit, the invisible thread that had once felt like pity pulled from the rich to the poor became something sturdier, a rope that could move weight in both directions. On one such afternoon, she brought a small basket of paper goods tied with a blue ribbon and explained with the matter-of-factness of a woman who has turned war budgets into household economies that a Veterans Association was hosting a fundraising fair by the Riverside Park and requested, not as a benefactor but as a conspirator, that Grace take a stall. They have enough speeches. They need steam. And added that she had already volunteered Han Mercer to drive, and that the commissar's office would look the other way if the stall fee were misfiled under community outreach. Han, tall and fox-faced with that comma of a scar at his jaw, arrived in an old flatbed whose green paint had learned to weather gracefully. He carried tables as if each were a story and took Evan on his shoulders so the boy could judge the world from 6'2". And at the park, the river glittered like cheap sequins in midday. Trees braced the light with a kindness only trees know, and a brass band of earnest teenagers attempted to herd the air into an anthem, while grandmothers in cotton dresses negotiated prices between morality and taste. Sarah Whitlow was there already, a table of second-hand paperbacks arranged by instinct rather than alphabet, a thermos of black tea perfuming her corner. She had cut her hair to just below the jaw, a practical decision that made her look like someone who wins arguments with editors, and wore a red headscarf that turned her freckles theatrical. She roped Grace into a barter, bowls for books, and by noon had become the kind of carnival barker small fairs deserve, calling passers-by to the noodle line with metaphors about broths that cure more than colds and dumplings that absolve original sins. She introduced Grace to the park warden, a man named Otis Lamb in his early 50s, with a torso shaped like a reliable barrel and a mustache that had chosen to grow wide rather than long, his uniform smelling faintly of cut grass and river algae, his eyes the steady brown of good dirt, and he greeted Button solemnly as "Sir," before confessing that dogs who did not bark at him were his weakness. Felix Tran, on weekend leave again, showed with his sleeves rolled to the biceps and a shy pride at a corporal's stripe stitched to one shoulder, hair grown a fraction too long in a way that suggested a mother somewhere might cut it the moment his head entered a kitchen. He carried bags, made change, fielded a small boy's questions about whether soldiers ate noodles or only thunder, and told Button, who regarded soldiers as a species of particularly earnest tree, to keep an eye on the cash box, which Button took to mean he should nap within 20 centimeters of it. Midway through the fair, the burned-faced man appeared not so much entering as anticipating where people would look and arriving there first. He wore the same too-good suit that had been too good last season, a hat whose brim made his eyes into private property, and the right side of his face carried the tight porcelain sheen of an old burn that had taught his skin a new patience. When he lifted a hand to examine a flyer, the cuff showed wrists with the fine hairs burned away, where fire had once taken the liberty to be rude, and Grace felt the subtle but unmistakable tightening of the day, as if someone somewhere had turned a knob down, and the band could not hear it. He did not take noodles. He took inventory of faces, of attitudes, of angles of cameras, on corners no camera had a right to be. And then he melted back into the crowd, leaving the impression of a question mark whose dot one should not step on. Sarah, delivering a tray of teacups at the time, saw the direction of Grace's gaze and said, with a tone that had a joke ready but chose not to tell it, that she had seen him around the docks years ago when ships came in wrong and went out poorer. Grace's stall sold out twice, and by closing time she had a wad of small bills that looked like the opposite of shame, wrists that ached pleasantly, and the sense that perhaps she had finally persuaded the city to memorize her name. That night, as she counted, there came a knock at the blue gate polite enough to be alarming, and on the threshold stood a young courier with government posture and a satchel that believed in bureaucracy. Nolan Pham, early 20s, tall in the way boys become when they outgrow beds faster than hopes, skin the even brown of a roasted chestnut, a narrow face saved from severity by a smile that kept trying to happen and then remembering its job, hair parted as if to please a photograph, and the agreeable odor of ink and rain. He asked for Grace Mung in a voice that offered neither familiarity nor distance, presented an envelope with a red stamp that made the skin of Grace's neck cool, and explained he was to wait for a signature and, if she would allow, a reply acknowledging receipt. The envelope bore the insignia of the military tribunal, and inside, written in the kind of language that prefers clauses to feelings, was a summons to appear as a witness in an inquiry into professional misconduct and criminal conspiracy involving one doctor, Veronica Truong. The date was 2 weeks hence. The location an administrative building whose facade tried to look like justice and succeeded at looking like a bank, and called upon Grace to bring any correspondence, evidence, or testimony to clarify events occurring at the Lark residence on the evening of the regimental reception and subsequent actions taken by parties known and unknown, which is how institutions talk about nights when women are drugged and set in beds that are not theirs. The paper trembled a fraction in Grace's hand, not because she feared telling the truth. Truth is a muscle farm girl's exercise daily lifting buckets of the stuff, but because the past had a habit of masquerading as a future, and she had just taught herself the opposite. Mrs. Lark arrived within the hour as if telegrams traveled faster when she was the recipient, Han in tow, and listened with the grave attention of someone appraising a bridge before crossing. She touched Grace's forearm in a quick, private gesture that meant both apology and alliance, and said that it was time, that rumors had ripened into facts, that the tribunal had found spine enough to hold its buildings upright, and that she would stand with Grace not at the stand, for that would be improper, but in every corridor that birthed orphans, as this one would likely try to do. In the days that followed, the city became a chessboard where Grace learned new pieces. Amelia Lynn guided her through the administrative undergrowth, insisting on extra copies and insisting again, producing a folder with tabbed dividers the color of a sensible rainbow, and instructing Grace in the ancient office art of writing a summary on the inside cover so no clerk could pretend to have lost the beginning of a story. Doctor. Mara, summoned for a statement regarding Evan's birth and Grace's condition, arrived in a pale linen shirt that made his beard look like an illustration, listened without interrupting, signed without grandstanding, and left a new paper crane on the counter that Evan immediately attempted to inspect with both hands and one determined mouth. Madame Chow contributed unsolicited advice regarding courtroom dress. Nothing that shines, darling, you are not a chandelier. Added a string of protection charms for Evan. It is not superstition if it calms the grandmother, and delivered a lecture on posture that could have been assigned to ballerinas. Commissar Chu sent a note in his own tidy hand, reassuring Grace that she would be escorted to and from the proceedings and adding a line about Truth enjoying a good pair of shoes. The unknown man reappeared 3 times in 1 week and intervened exactly once. Evan, discovering that gravity is the partner of curiosity, slipped his hand from Button's collar and toddled toward the mouth of the lane where scooters rehearsed their disobedience. And the man, arriving as if scheduled by worry itself, scooped the boy with the neat competence of someone who had fathered and lost or had practiced both in hypothetical, turning Evan back toward the blue gate with a muttered comment about princes who should watch their borders. His eyes, seen this close, were the gray of a sky that has made peace with rain, and there was a nick in the left ear that matched none of his other injuries, and so was awarded a story of its own. Perhaps a bottle, perhaps a fall, perhaps a beloved's bad temper, before he put his hat back on, the moment like a seal, and faded away. Sarah, who had watched with the held breath of an ant, said later that men who rescue children do not always turn out to be safe, and men who avoid them are not always dangerous, which is the sort of wisdom that is useless until you need it. News from the front arrived in two flavors: letters in Logan's economical hand and rumors dressed in speculative certainty. The letters spoke of food and weather and how his unit had taught a village to channel water. Details arranged so carefully around the blank spaces that the blank spaces were almost polite, and the rumors shrugged into existence at the market by a fishmonger whose cousin's neighbor had a brother in a transport regiment hinted that the tribunal's sudden bravery had something to do with a cousin of Veronica's being overheard at a wedding speaking of closing accounts. Grace folded the letters back into their envelopes and put them under the salt jar because salt had never betrayed her. On a Tuesday heavy with heat, Inspector Dwan returned with a subordinate who looked like the new edition of an old book, slimmer, keener, marginally more literate in both senses. Jerome Way, mid-30s, narrow shoulders made to look wider by habitually squared posture, a short boxed beard trimmed into respectability, hair parted with engineering exactness. A tie that suggested someone else's salary had been thanked. He explained, in tones that could oil hinges, that an anonymous complaint had been filed alleging Grace's kitchen produced odors unsuited to a residential lane, and that an inspection would be conducted with the fairness of an ungreased wheel. Amelia Lynn arrived midway like cavalry in sensible shoes, carrying a clipboard that had frightened better men than these, and stood at Grace's side answering each bureaucratic swing with a document that had already met the swing halfway. And by the time Mrs. Lark's sedan arrived, Inspector Dwan had found reason to admire Grace's sanitation schedule and to warn her, in the voice of a man who will pretend the warning is his gift to you, that enemies often use forms when fists fail. 2 nights before the tribunal, Felix came to the gate with hollows under his eyes that made his youth look like something he had misplaced and could not retrieve. He had been reassigned to a supply detail after a convoy he rode backup for, was pinned for 3 hours at a washed-out bridge, and the quiet he had stored in his bones during those hours had decided to remain as a tenant. Grace fed him without comment. Button pressed a head into his knee and doctor. Mara, arriving to check Evan's ears, stayed to teach Felix the trick of sleeping in small, reliable units, breath counts, shoulder drops, a hand on the dog's flank to measure steadier rhythms than your own. And when he left, Felix's handshake contained the thanks of the stubborn, which is to say sincere and awkward and real. The tribunal morning arrived in suits and starch. Grace wore a plain navy dress that Sarah had altered to sit like modesty instead of poverty. Hair tied back, a small pin on her collar that had belonged to her mother and looked like a leaf, making up its mind to be metal. Mrs. Lark met her at the commissar's office, a gray building softened by potted palms that had seen more second chances than verdicts. And Han drove them in silence, broken only by Evan's conversation with Button, who had refused to be left and whose attendance was justified to the guard as therapy, with such confidence that no one insisted on a certificate. Nolan Pham greeted them at the door with an expression that tried to be neutral and failed into friendliness, and led them to a witness room with a window that looked on nothing in particular, which is what windows in buildings like this are encouraged to do. The hearing room smelled faintly of polish and opinions. A panel of 3 officers sat at a dais, pretending not to be human, and failing that, to be at least exceptional humans. One was a woman, Captain Lemin, late 30s, with a face both fine-boned and stubborn, hair in a bun that bowed to neither fashion nor comfort, uniform immaculate, eyes like 2 plumb lines the world had better align with. Another was an older man with the relaxed cruelty of someone who believes virtue is a matter of posture and had practiced his. The third was a younger officer with spectacles that had not yet learned how to be part of a face and kept flashing commitment whenever he moved. Veronica appeared flanked by a lawyer with shoulders that had opinions about suits. She was as beautiful as winter architecture, lips lacquered to seem edible and not to be eaten, hair a glossy fall across one shoulder. And for the first time, Grace saw the fatigue in her eyes. Not regret, not recognition, but fatigue. The kind that attends people whose plans are beginning to demand more energy than they return. The burn-faced man stood at the rear wall, like a shadow that had decided to live upright, hands in pockets, hat off, hair close-cropped with the stripes of barber indifference. And when Grace's gaze reached him, he tipped 2 fingers by his temple, in a greeting that did not ask to be returned. Questions moved like cautious dancers, stepping around landmines of propriety. Grace told the story as one tells a harvest. Dates, weights, weather, the order of operations, interruptions cutting in with objections that Captain Lemin swatted away not unkindly, but efficiently. And when Veronica's counsel suggested that a servant's memory might be inclined to embroider, Mrs. Lark's spine straightened by 3 degrees, which is the posture of a blade, and Captain Lemin asked the counsel whether he was implying that poverty erodes perception, while wealth refines it, and whether he would like to enter that notion into the record with his name attached for posterity's amusement. The lawyer found other avenues to explore. Evidence arrived in paper and consequence. A bottle of the evening's wine was introduced, its contents long evaporated into legend, but the fingerprinting report sketched a chemistry of nightshades and a residue that belonged more to Veronica's workbench than any vineyard. Photographs from the camera Veronica had brandished like a talisman were submitted, and then, to Veronica's visible shock, withdrawn by the tribunal, when it became clear the camera's owner had turned it over with a sworn statement describing the conditions under which it had been used. The sworn statement belonged to a cousin in the Truong family, a woman with a scar under her chin from a childhood fall, and a conscience that had come late to the party. And though she was not present, her absence had the weight of a presence that knows it will interest future gossip. When it was over, after signatures and a caution from a clerk about not speaking to journalists who did not yet exist, Grace stood in the bright corridor with the knowledge that outcomes take the scenic route. Veronica paused as she passed, eyes skimming Grace as if she were an inventory sheet that had failed to calculate correctly, and said in a voice too quiet to be entered into any record, "You will find the city is hungrier than you are," which is the sort of curse people give when they run out of courage. Grace did not reply, not because she could not, she had rehearsed speeches by lamplight, but because Captain Lemin's presence beside her made replies redundant. The captain's mouth moved as if chewing on a thought, and then she said, "Apropos of nothing and everything, teach your son to swim early. The city is mostly water if you look at it sideways." Outside, the sky had been washed. Button led them to the car with the puffed chest of a dog who has escorted important women past men in hats, and Sarah, who had waited in a cafe nearby pretending to be absorbed in a book while reading every person who crossed the threshold, joined them to walk back through streets that had learned their names. They arrived to find the blue gate tied with a ribbon someone had threaded through the slats, a bouquet of awkward lilies propped in a borrowed jar on the stoop, and a note under the jar in a hand that apologized for itself. Jerome Ways, saying that the anonymous complaint had been withdrawn and that he would be grateful if Grace could pretend he had been helpful, so that his daughter would not grow up thinking her father was only a man who checked boxes. Grace laughed then, a small clean sound like water tapping porcelain, and took the lilies inside where they could learn the room, arrange them in the least chipped vase, and fed the household, dog, cat, child, widow, friend, with the deliberate slowness that turns dinner into absolution. Later, sitting in the courtyard under a sky so clear it made the day feel inevitable, she unfolded one more letter from Logan that had come while they were out. 3 lines and a drawing of a bowl and chopsticks, as if his hand had needed to remember curves, and she again put it under the salt. The burned-faced man passed the gate once, not stopping, not accelerating, the set of his shoulders a message neither friendly nor hostile, but possibly future, and in the quiet that followed, Grace thought not of what the tribunal would decree. It would decree what it always decreed, and then someone would make it mean something, but of the odd calm that had settled on Evan's face when Captain Lemin had nodded to him, as if he sensed systems rearranging themselves a millimeter, which is how mountains move when they are patient. Autumn in South City arrived first to the nose and only later to the skin, a faint, clean edge in the air that made broth seem wiser and iron stair rails cooler to the touch. And because Captain Lemin had said a city is mostly water if you look at it sideways, Grace decided to learn the city that way and took Evan to Riverlight Baths at the bend of the boulevard, where steam pressed its forehead to glass and echoing whistles stitched order across the pool. The coach, running the shallow lanes, was Mrs. Lien Dang, mid-50s and compact like a coiled spring, sun-browned shoulders thick with use, hair clipped into a no-nonsense cap of pepper gray, a whistle that could reorganize a small nation hanging from her neck, deep-set eyes that missed nothing but chose what to correct with the mercy of a grandmother and the insistence of a drill sergeant. She evaluated Evan with the practiced scan of someone who could divine a child's temperament by the angle of his splash, then fetched a bright orange float as if issuing a medal, and asked Grace to step in too, because children learn courage from seeing it. The lifeguard on the tall chair was Tuan Ngo. "Call me Red," he grinned, though nothing about him was red but the lanyard. 28, long-legged and lazily graceful in the way of men who have always known their limbs would do what was asked. Angular jaw softened by a day's stubble that never quite made it into a beard, old scars white on brown shins from teenage scrapes with bicycles and bad ideas, an easy voice that kept panic at arm's length and sometimes sang under his breath when the pool was quiet. Evan discovered that water could hold him if he offered trust and a little kicking, and Button discovered that the rules posted did not include no dogs, which meant they did, but that he would ignore them until asked twice. So he lay in a pool of sun by the glass and performed breathing exercises with the seriousness of a monk, while Ink, who had come only because Sarah Whitlow had bribed him with the promise of a cardboard box afterwards, visited each tiled corner, disapproved, and returned home with the disdain of an aesthete. Paper multiplies when life tries to make itself official, and Amelia Lynn shepherded Grace through a licensing addendum so that soy milk mornings could legally become a thing. Amelia wore a navy skirt suit that made paper think twice, circular glasses glinting like small moons, hair pinned with functionality over fashion, and she marked a neat rectangle on Grace's copy of the menu labeled seasonal, and wrote in a hand that could have drawn maps, pumpkin congee, sesame rice balls, chrysanthemum tea, noting as she did that city inspectors responded well to the scent of chrysanthemums, which if you took the long view was why dynasties used them on seals. Madame Chio seconded approval with a flourish of bangles and a story about an emperor who fell in love with a soup vendor and then decreed all soups should be properly priced, which Grace translated to mean that her bowls would remain affordable because hunger should not have to bargain with dignity. Prosperity draws shadows the way lanterns draw moths, and on a breezy Thursday, a man named Chow Jin placed his signboard at the corner of the lane, Jin Chow Noodles, tradition. Since 1971, though no two people could agree if they had ever seen him there before, Jin was late 40s with the hands of a man who had held money longer than he had held knives. Wrists soft, a pencil mustache presiding over lips set to permanent calculation, hair slicked into place by an oil that smelled like the memory of lemons. And he had the habit of standing with his thumbs in his vest pockets to advertise both vest and pockets as repositories of importance. He sent a boy round with a stack of flyers offering a bowl 2 coins cheaper than Grace's and a free tea for anyone who brought a friend, and he set a portable radio on his counter tuned to a station where callers traded rumors for applause. And by mid-afternoon, the lane learned what envy sounds like when it gets a microphone. Grace kept stirring and tasting, pouring soy milk while the mill moaned kindly and counting change twice because money is like cats. It respects your attention. Sarah, who had a doctorate in the taxonomy of gossip earned on the docks and in widows' kitchens, moved through the line with that mischief in her eye that means the story will be defanged by the time she is done with it, calling out Gin's special as nostalgia priced, which made 3 men laugh and 1 return a flyer with apologetic hands. If rumors are the city's tide, newspapers are its moon, and a reporter arrived whose job was to decide which way water should lean. Clara Yen worked for the South City Herald, early 30s, narrow and quick like a blade that prefers its sheath, hair cut into a sharp bob that made turning her head seem like punctuation, lips painted the exact color of unripe cherries, a notepad that had suffered from being flipped open with impatience, and she wore a black blazer despite the lingering heat because seriousness prefers discomfort. At her flank trailed an intern like a hopeful comma, Daisy Kwong, 21, bobbed hair the brown of chestnuts under glass, a scattering of gentle freckles dusting a face that refused to learn cynicism, sneakers scuffed by sincerity, a voice that wanted to be brave and sometimes made it, a camera hanging from her neck that she held like a promise. Clara asked questions with the politeness of a thief. Why the Lark elders ate here, whether Grace had ever been a nanny in their home, whether it was true that a doctor fiancé had accused her of what the city wished to call a scandal and the law would call a crime. And she raised one eyebrow when Grace answered simply that she cooked, that customers chose their own chairs, that she would testify because truth was owed to herself and to women whose names she did not know. Clara left with a story forming like condensation on a glass, and Daisy left with a bag of sesame rice balls tucked under her notes and a whispered, "I'll try to help," which Grace did not require but appreciated the way a shop appreciates a broom that leans available. The burned-faced man put a name into the air without quite owning it. Sarah, who had made it her business to find out where shadows buy their hats, said the docs called him Mr. Ash, not because of the burn, though the right side of his face had the polished, tight-lipped patience of healed fire, but because he tended to appear after things had burned down and people decided to sift. He was mid-40s, perhaps, lean in a way that announced he had eaten more bad choices than bad meals, beard close-cropped into a frost that made his mouth a private matter, eyes the color of weather when it commits to rain, suit too good to be new, shoes that loved sidewalks, hands that stayed in pockets until necessary, and he acquired information the way cats acquire chairs, by sitting on them until everyone forgot they had ever been anyone else's. He came by the lane after dark and leaned on the gate with the temporary ownership of a man testing fences, and he said to Grace without preamble that somebody would use her shop as a message if they could not use her as a warning, and that if a brick came through her window, she should let it be the brick that saved someone else's window the next time by having a second pane ready. And then he tipped 2 fingers as if saluting an idea and was gone, which is the kind of advice that sounds like a parable until the brick arrives. It did, the next night, a clumsy arc that Button noticed before gravity did, the dog lurching from his burgundy of sleep to place his body between glass and cradle, as if he had been born knowing where the important things were. The brick shattered on the sill instead of the floor, because Ash had suggested moving the crib, and Button's bark spun the lane into alertness. Han Mercer was there first because drivers do not sleep as deeply as they might when the people they ferry are in homes with blue gates, and he streaked down the lane like punctuation. The fox sharp face gone harder, hands sure. The culprit was a boy about 15 in a cap that wanted to be anonymous and a jacket too big for him. Knobby and scared and angling away toward Jin Chow's corner with the guilty choreography of cowardice. Han caught him without making a sport of it and stood him under the lamplight long enough for Grace to notice the raw nervousness of his cuticles and the tangle of hunger in his eyes. This was not a hired knife so much as a borrowed hand. When asked who put him to it, he shifted and tried on 3 lies before settling on silence, which is the only defense the poor are taught to afford. Mrs. Lark arrived in a robe that made silk remember its duty as armor, hair loose, eyes iron, and took in the boy the way a commander takes in a battlefield as a sum of logistics and blame. And then, with a breath that turned judgment into policy, asked Han to take him to Otis Lamb at the park office because Otis had a talent for scaring boys straight without turning them into cases. Jin Chow watched from his corner with a smile that was not interested in joy. The newspaper landed the following morning like weather. Clara's article led the city section with a photograph artfully framed so that Mrs. Lark's hand on Evan's head looked like benediction. But the caption asked whether influence had a taste. The text performed acrobatics across the trapeze of fairness and fell occasionally into the net of insinuation, asking whether a woman of humble origins could be said to be free if powerful patrons always happened to be nearby. Daisy's sidebar profile, however, was simple. The story of a widow with a shop, a dog and a cat with names, a child with eyes like a question, and a bowl of broth that had calmed a park warden's grief the day after his sister died, and photographs lit by the honesty of afternoon rather than the drama of night. The net effect was a city half inclined to raise an eyebrow and half inclined to raise a spoon, which meant business was brisk by lunch. Commander Lark arrived, not in disguise because some shoulders were not built for it, and took a stool at the end of the counter with the care of a man sitting down to be seen sitting down, asking loudly for extra scallions because salt had been discouraged by Doctor. Mara and he had decided to be obedient in public at least. Doctor. Mara, who had been called the week before when the commander had gone briefly pale under the persimmon tree and had handled the moment with the firm softness of a riverbank, had adjusted medications and scolded with humor, and now he leaned against the wall to drink soy milk and told Felix Tran, who stood nearby in civilian shirt and uniform posture, that a man could be brave without being careless, and that courage should learn to leave a forwarding address. Mid-Autumn Festival poured itself over the river like someone had opened a drawer of light and forgot to close it. Lanterns bobbed like tame planets. Children dragged their parents by the wrists toward drums and sweets. Otis Lamb presided over the park with the benevolent tyranny of a monarch whose islands were benches and bins. And Grace's stall anchored a corner where steam rose into the lamps and blurred people into kinder shapes. Daisy Kwong volunteered to help. Sleeves pushed up, hair tucked under a scarf patterned with tiny moons, and she proved adept at the delicate diplomacy of festival cues, talking down a man who believed his hunger was elder to a dozen others, and coaxing two toddlers into sharing a stool by telling them a story about rice balls learning to roll uphill with teamwork. Ink declined to attend because dignified cats do not consent to drumlines, but Button threaded himself through, ankles and stationed at the back of the stall where he could see both Evan and the world. A woman approached the counter with the small, controlled intensity of people used to setting traps and being disappointed when they catch only rabbits. Leah Pham, late 20s, tiny with sharp bangs like quotation marks, lipstick that hummed at the edge of garish, a bracelet of thin gold bands that told on her wrists every time she moved, and she introduced herself as a friend of Veronica's from the hospital, eyes skimming Grace the way a shopper checks fabric for flaws. She said public opinion was a river, and this stall threatened to divert it, that Veronica would be harmed in ways people like Grace do not calculate, that the tribunal had other evidence, and that loyalty to the Larks was, here she searched for a word, unsustainable. Sarah had materialized at Grace's elbow with that artful slouch of hers that suggests boredom, but means danger. And she asked Leah whether medicine had taught her bedside manners or whether the syllabus had been replaced with sabotage, and Leah's mouth compressed into a needle, and then Captain Lemin happened to pass through the lantern light in civilian blouse and trousers, a paper bag of candied hawthorn in one hand, and the air changed temperature. The captain nodded to Grace like a colleague, turned to Leah with professional politeness that could break a spine, and said that witness tampering wore many perfumes, some of them expensive, and that pharmacists who sold such would find themselves out of stock. Leah said nothing, because sometimes the only safe answer is to leave with all the syllables you brought, and she did, small and sharp-backed as a knife returned to a drawer. The tribunal posted a notice 2 days later, a document written in a hand too tidy to belong to fate. Proceedings would continue. Evidence had thickened. Veronica Truong was suspended from duty, pending outcome, and forbidden to practice in any capacity, private or public. Travel restricted. Contact with witnesses prohibited. Nolan Pham delivered the copy with his usual gentle competence and a quiet aside that his own sister would now have to take her stitches elsewhere, which was inconvenient but fair, and he grinned as if fairness that inconveniences the powerful tastes particularly good on the tongue. Mr. Ash watched the exchange from the mouth of the lane with the tilted head curiosity of a crow, and when Nolan left, he gave Grace a card, printed only with a chess knight, and a telephone number handwritten once, and then again as if the first time might evaporate, and said, if anyone suggests a fire would make insurance, look at your stall kindly. Call me before the match is struck. Some people in this town grew up thinking smoke is a seasoning, the shop breathed. That is what you learn when you own one, that walls inhale and exhale through doors and hours and people. And on a Monday that smelled like roasted chestnuts and damp, Stone Grace found a letter in Logan's rectangle of hand, longer than usual, ink pressed a little deeper as if the pen had wanted to stay. He wrote that redeployments were under discussion, and he might be closer by winter, or exactly the same distance by spring, that he had taught a boy to braid a sling and a man to write his name, that in a market at dawn he had seen a woman sell persimmons and thought of the tree in their courtyard, and then had bought one and pressed it flat between the pages of his pocket notebook to send if it survived, which it had not, but that the intention should count for something. He added a small drawing of Button with a medal and a caption, Commissar of Sleep, and asked Grace to kiss Evan twice, once for bravery, once for naps, and once for herself if she had time. She had time. At the pool, Mrs. Leon declared Evan ready to jump unassisted from the low edge to Grace with Red's hand hovering nearby like a rumor of safety, and the boy did it with the solemn mirth of someone stepping into a story that had been waiting for him, and the water took him and returned him, and Red laughed from somewhere honest in his chest, and Grace inhaled the exact moment fear became skill, and understood why Captain Lemin recommended swimming. At home, Amelia dropped off a laminated copy of the health inspection with a 98 scrawled in a satisfying hand, and said the missing 2 points were for the cracked tile they both knew about, and the inspector wanted to feel useful. Felix taught Button to stay. When scooters screamed past, discovered he had been teaching himself, and returned to base with shoulders slightly less defensive. Commander Lark came by with a new habit of sitting longer, not because his legs demanded it, but because his heart did, and because looking at Evan learned him something softer about legacy, that Metals had failed to propose. Doctor. Mara reminded him not to turn rice into a condiment and brought him a little jar of spice that tasted like autumn. The young brick thrower reappeared with a mother and a bowl in his hands rather than a weapon. The mother narrow and exhausted in a way that sleep could not repair, elbows sharp, scarf frayed, eyes prepared to fight everyone and ask forgiveness after. Otis Lamb had put him on park cleanup and had called it a citizenship course. And Grace put extra beef in the bowl because humiliation is not protein and people need the latter. And the boy, stripping guilt into words, admitted that a man with slick hair and a pencil mustache had floated the idea in a way that made it sound like community service. And then he cried a little because children do when their bodies realize the error before their status does. Sarah paid their bowl with money Grace would never return and told the mother that pride tastes better with broth than with air. Rumor tried again in the form of a radio segment where a host with an affectionate sneer asked whether charity wasn't just the rich, laundering their conscience through noodle shops, and Mrs. Lark answered by organizing a mother's circle at the stall on Wednesdays, chairs arranged like an embrace, topics negotiated by tea, and when a woman asked whether it was true that power always protects its own, Mrs. Lark said that power is a tool and that hands decide. Some cut bread, some throw bricks, some build steps, and that she would like to be caught doing the first and the third. It was not a quote the radio could use, which is how you know it was good. Toward month's end, the wind came off the river with that particular mood autumn has when it tries on winter for fit, and Grace hung a small bell inside the blue gate because, Mister, Ash had said doors tell you stories if you let them, and she added a second lock, not out of fear, but out of thrift, replacing glass costs more than buying steel. Ink settled on the high shelf and perfected a look that made thieves reconsider their relationship to shame, and Button discovered the exact place on the floor where he could guard 3 things at once: the cradle, the cash box, and the threshold, and he lay across it like a sentence that ends arguments. The burned-faced man passed now and then, and sometimes did not, and Jin Chow's radio learned to play softer, and Daisy brought by a clipping of her sidebar with a red ink circle around a line about Grace's broth being merciful, saying her editor had tried to cut it for sentiment, and she had fought for it because sentiment is what happens when feelings know how to spell, and they ate mooncakes left over from a festival that had already rolled itself into memory, and Grace read Logan's letter again with the care of someone studying a map, and measured the distance between here and there in bowls served. Nights slept, meters swum, paper cranes folded, and found that the numbers added up to something sturdier than waiting. They added up to a life built under lanterns that kept relighting themselves no matter who blew. Winter walked into South City wearing the pale coat of its intentions, not yet cruel, the river taking on that pewter sheen that makes reflections seem like promises rather than copies, and the shop adjusted its breathing to meet the season, broth a shade deeper, scallion oil warming on the back ring, sesame rice balls lifting like little moons. Grace woke earlier because cold requires persuasion. Evan's hair stood in a static crown that made him look perpetually surprised by good news. Ink slept on the high shelf pretending to be a porcelain cat that sometimes blinked, and Button had decided the precise square of floor on which to place his ribs so that his body could still triangulate threshold, cradle, and cash box. The tribunal set its closing date with the blank finality of a stamp, and the building, with more corridors than opinions, summoned them all again. The panel was the same geometry. Captain Lemin, the plumb line, the older man who believed posture could be a moral philosophy, the younger officer whose glasses had now learned to sit without flashing their ambition. Joined this time by a legal advisor in a dove-gray uniform whose cuffs displayed their jurisprudence with two tasteful stripes, Judge Colonel Thao Nguyen, early 50s with a calm face that wore wrinkles like citations, square shoulders that looked better carrying books than rifles, hair clipped to a sober, dignified line, fingers ink-stained from too much marginalia, voice low and precise in that way that makes a room perform honesty. The prosecutor was Major Phuong Tran, 40 with sharp cheekbones and an athlete's carriage turned to desk warfare, eyes bright, hair slicked back as if not to obscure decisions. And the defense lawyer had the same carnivore suit and the same shoulders that governed neckties rather than the reverse. Veronica entered as if the air should support her and seemed irritated that it did merely permit her. Winter white coat, mouth lacquered to the bravery of cherries, a weary glitter in the pupil that said she had been sleeping on a bed made of rationalizations. At the rear wall, Mr. Ashe leaned into his anonymity with professional thoroughness, hat off to show a hairline the barber had negotiated to a close piece, the shiny tight-poured half of his face catching the light like an unasked question, beard trimmed to a dusk that allowed neither softness nor cruelty to take over, suit pressed but never smug. Testimony, which had been buckets and dates and the algebra of nightshade residues, was folded now into argument. Major Tran, a tidy fury in a tailored frame, drew lines between Veronica's access to controlled substances, the fingerprints on a decanter that had never been hers to touch, the cousin's sworn statement, the photographs whose chain of custody had been rescued by shame late, but not too late, and the medical opinion from doctor. Mara that testified to the timeline of nausea and the birth that followed. The defense walked heavy, shoes around the same ground trying to flatten it, suggesting opportunity created by proximity, implying memory embroidered by poverty's need for narrative, then suggesting consent in places where drugs had been, and every time Captain Lemin rotated a single eyebrow up and the lawyer backed two verbs away. Judge Colonel Thao's questions did not arrive like knives but like rulers, measuring angles, finding them wanting when they wobbled. He asked why a hospital unlocked its storeroom for a fiancé, what protocols allow photographs to be taken of sleeping employees, how an engagement ring can be wielded as proof against fraud rather than as a talisman for it. And when Veronica answered in that polished, faintly bored tone people use when they practice their lines in the mirror, his mouth drew a little tighter, which is how the law frowns. The verdict did what verdicts do when enough small, honest things are stacked into a wall. It held. Veronica Truong, found guilty of professional misconduct, criminal conspiracy in the administration of a sedative, and obstruction in the form of intimidation, licensed suspended permanently, sentenced to a term that would honor both the harm and the deterrence. 5 years, said in such a way that the room heard the word as a geography. Conditions attached that would ensure she could never again hold a syringe on anyone's behalf. The room did not cheer because rooms like that do not. But something loosened in people's shoulders, and even the older officer who believed posture could keep ships afloat sat back as if admitting that sometimes gravity is the more honest god. Veronica glanced past Grace the way one looks past a lamppost that had the audacity to be installed where one wanted to place a bench, and for a brief, unguarded instant contempt fell away, and a very old expression showed through. Fear, perhaps, or the knowledge that the river of public opinion flooded in both directions, and then she was escorted out by two marshals with faces like locked drawers. Sergeant Keat Vaux, compact, mustached, left forearm tattooed with a string of numbers that were likely not lucky, and Lance Corporal Bea Nguyen, tall for the service, shoulders a moral argument, hair braided close to keep decisions away from her ears, mouth set in the determined line of a woman who has had to correct men at least once a week for a decade, and they did their duty with the gentle efficiency of people who know humanity is easiest to misplace when uniforms are worn. Outside, the air felt laundered. News traveled as it does in cities, in the mouths of people moving in opposite directions while carrying identical conclusions. Clara Yen took notes with the canniness of a blade that knows where ribs are. Daisy Kwang cried a little and pretended it was wind, and Nolan Pham logged the exit time in his government book with the neatness of a man who respects his ink. Commissar Chu shook Grace's hand with both of his, the gesture of a man whose job is to hold two truths at once and make the third possible, and Mrs. Lark pressed her cheek to Grace's temple for a heartbeat that felt like permission. That night, mister. Ash walked beside the blue gate as if it had asked him to escort it, and said quietly that trials close one door and open 3 windows, which is elegant but drafty. That people who had ridden Veronica's influence like a ferry would now be looking for a bridge. That one such bridge, like to be built out of small businesses that might burn and claim insurance and vacate conveniently for the next idea. He produced, like a magician with a conscience, a thin ledger he had quietly pickpocketed with consent from a bored bookkeeper, copies of invoices that place cleaning services at odd hours, deposited by a company registered to a nephew of Jin Chow, receipts signed by a hand that trembled too much to belong to restaurants, and a pattern of visits to 3 shops that had suffered late-night electrical accidents. He asked if Grace would like him to be a wall, and Grace, who had learned that pride feeds no children and that alliances with strange men with burned faces are sometimes what good mothers choose, said yes. And he grinned, which is to say his mouth pretended to be a smile and his eyes approved. The sting that followed did not operate like cinema. No car chases, no shouted freeze, but like a careful kitchen, mise en place, all the right pots on low heat. Daisy set her camera to watch the lane's mouth from a second-floor window above Madame Chow's tea habits. Clara negotiated an anonymous source with the kind of triple encryption usually reserved for bad marriages. Amelia arranged a coincidental inspection for 2 adjacent shops that would place Inspector Dwan and his improved sidekick, Jerome Wei, inconveniently near at the hour the ledger predicted. Han practiced parking where his flatbed could quietly become a barricade. Otis Lamb rearranged a patrol route to bring a pair of park wardens with flashlights the brightness of opinions, and Captain Lemin, who technically had no jurisdiction but an excellent sense of gravity's direction, placed 2 unmarked officers at the corner with the bored air of men who are about to be suddenly useful. When the van arrived, gray, too clean in a city where vehicles maintain an honest patina, its license plate corresponded neatly to a stolen sequence in Amelia's file, and when 2 men climbed out, they wore the casualness of people who believe locks are merely shyness adopted by doors, one tall with a goatee attempting to compensate for a weak chin, the other broad with a hawk nose and an affection for his own reflection displayed in mirrored sunglasses at night. A comedy Grace might have appreciated on any other evening. They carried a crate labeled beans that clinked like not beans, moved toward Grace's shuttered window with the self-assignation of employees at a job, and met instead buttons. Growl, low and continental, the flatbed sliding forward, the wardens stepping in with the easy authority of men who can call more men, Jerome's baritone asking with oily civility to see a work order for midnight maintenance, Dwan remembering that bribery feels different under starlight and choosing, for once, civic virtue, the unmarked officers declaiming identification in unshowy voices, and Mr. Ashe removing his hands from his pockets at last to demonstrate that a man can be both warning and help, guiding the hawk-nosed one into a lamppost in a way that sounded like someone closing a drawer. They found accelerant, rags, a strip of slow-burning fuse. They found in the goateed man's phone a text that had recommended the one with the blue gate, complete with a pay-up-front order from JC routed through a nephew's number. Jin Chao, awakened from the kind of sleep wealthy cowards enjoy, protested a frame of mythic proportions until the ledger details turned the myth into a receipt. And then he sat in Otis Lamb's office, looking small in a chair that had never failed to hold men larger, and signed a statement like a man who has just discovered the cost of reluctance. Grace opened the shop next morning with a lock that had opinions newly strengthened, a modest sign taped to the window reading, "Thank you, neighbors," and pots doing their beautiful burbling. The lane responded with chairs scooted closer together, a festival of errand excuses that involved checking in without saying so. Daisy filmed exactly 3 seconds of Button, wagging at a toddler, and made a reel that half the city watched before noon, and Clara wrote 2 pieces. The first, a straight account of an attempted arson and the arrests that followed. The second, a quiet column about how shops breathe, and how sometimes the people of a street form the ribcage, and how a dog can be an organ necessary to survival without ever going to school. In the middle of the lunch rush, Logan arrived not as a miracle, but as a man who had asked for leave and been granted it because paperwork occasionally loses its taste for bureaucracy. He wore fatigue pants and a civilian sweater borrowed from a quartermaster with a sense of humor, a day's beard that made him look like a promise rather than a plan, eyes slightly lighter than Grace remembered, because they were not currently directed at sand, and he stood in the doorway for a compact eternity, while the room rallied. Mrs. Lark candid her head to hide a tear behind a pearl. Commander Lark cleared his throat as if removing a stone from a river. Amelia Lynn pretended to hunt a stamp that was in her other hand. Sarah shouted, "You're late!" and hugged him until he laughed. Felix saluted with a spoon. Button performed a dance that involved all 4 paws and his dignity. And then Evan, deciding decisiveness is inherited, hurled himself across space with arms that believed in their own length and was caught. There's a kind of silence that eats words on arrival and turns them into warmth instead. They ate, which is to say they forgave each other for timing they could not govern. They walked the river, which is to say they practiced patience out loud. They visited riverlight baths because Captain Lemin had recommended water as if she were prescribing religion, and Logan watched his son jump smugly into the shallow lane and grinned like a thief who has stolen back something that belonged to him. That evening, in the courtyard that smelled like star anise and cold iron, Logan produced a small box that had traveled too far for anything inside to be as unruffled as if it had lived in a drawer. Inside, a ring without pomp, a modest oval of jade the exact green of the persimmon leaves at noon, set in a band of brushed gold, obviously chosen by a man who had looked for a medal that would not shout, and asked, without kneeling because the earth was cold and because Grace had never demanded humble theater from men, whether she would formalize what the city had already memorized. She laughed, mouth covered in surprise, eyes wet, and said yes, in the tone of a cook, accepting the right knife into her palm. The registry office next morning smelled of ink and wintered wood. A clerk named Mrs. Beatrice Vaux handled their file with the dignified fuss of a churchwarden, tending candles, early 60s with a bun that had become an institution, glasses on a chain that swung like a metronome for morality, the soft hands of someone whose labor was listening, an affection for blue stamps that made the pages feel official the way a hug makes children feel real. She complimented the baby, scolded the soldier gently for making mothers wait, told Grace her middle name was her own, and pressed a raised seal down as if blessing a forehead. Han brought flowers that looked like the neighborhood had voted. Amelia brought a folder labeled, "For the next bureaucracy." Sarah brought laughter you could put on toast. Felix brought a promise to teach Evan to tie the difficult knot doctor. Mara brought a tiny knitted hat he alleged had been made by a volunteer at the clinic, but which bore the signature unevenness of his own first attempt. Daisy took photographs that looked like truth, even if they called themselves document. Clara did not write because some things belong to kitchens, and Captain Lemin sent a card with a sketch swimmer and the line, "The city is water." You built a boat. The case against Jin Chao proceeded with the unglamorous dignity of civic housekeeping. He admitted instigating vandalism under pressure from a property fixer who preferred desperate tenants to rooted ones. He named the fixer named the financier, and the chain ended in a notary office with locks too new, where men with pens more expensive than courage signed agreements they did not wish to explain to their wives. Inspector Dwan underwent a late-life reformation the city greeted with cautious applause. Jerome Way applied for a transfer to the licensing office because, he said in a note delivered with lilies, he had learned he liked checking boxes that helped. And Otis Lamb found the brick thrower boy a part-time job sweeping the park and then manning the rental boats, teaching him to tie knots and to return change with a smile, which is a civilization. Mr. Ash, asked at last for a real name, said that the docs had called him Min Ann once, but that names he liked tended to belong to people who had not burned, and that Ash was simpler in the mouth. He confessed a child once, a fever, a night where the ferry ran late, a woman who had preferred her anger to marriage, and then he stopped because some stories were to be folded and placed under salt, like letters, until someone found a way to heal them. He brought Grace a gift the day before Logan's unit whistled him back. A small brass bell for the blue gate tuned to a note that made people think of winter streets and warm soup. He shook Logan's hand with a nod that diplomatically omitted gratitude, and included it anyway. He scratched Button's ear with the practiced affection of a man who knows dogs better than men, and said, "Keep him fat. The world is not kind to thin dogs." Snow, when it came, arrived first as rumor, then as a startled shower, then as commitment. The shop steamed, bowls moved from hand to hand, the bell chimed, the river kept its pewter. Commander Lark took to walking Evan to the park and back like a man escorting tomorrow to rehearsal. Mrs. Lark brought a small velvet box and fastened around Grace's wrist a thin jade bangle that had been a promise in another life and now wanted to be one in this. Amelia drew up a 10-year plan and taped it inside Grace's pantry where only women of sense would see it. Sarah moved into a flat across the lane because widows find each other and build cities out of kindness. Red taught Evan to float on his back and count clouds as if counting gods. Mrs. Leon corrected Logan's dive once and pretended not to smirk when he swallowed water. Clara made a book out of photographs of small shops and titled it R.I.B. Cages. Daisy won a staff position and a new camera and still came by to fold paper cranes with Evan because ritual is a raft. Nolan delivered one more letter with a seal, redeployment within a day's travel of South City, and a smile that said the ink had been worth it. And on an ordinary night of good trade and correct change, Button lay in his exact square of floor. Ink blinked like an old magistrate forgiving a first offense. The bell hummed, and Grace counted backwards from 10 to 1 before closing. Because this is what cooks do when the city and their own hearts have both eaten well. They count down not to end, but to hold time still and name it once as theirs. As miracles aren't thunderclaps. They're the small mercies that keep us warm. A bowl of broth on a cold night, a hand that tells the truth in a room full of power, a ragged-eared dog standing guard, a mother who refuses to quit. When we choose love over fear and truth over silence, God lays a gentle hand on our shoulder and opens a path through the dark. In everyday life, cook one honest meal, forgive one small wrong, hold a loved one's hand a heartbeat longer. These are the places where God still works wonders. If this story touched you, share it with a friend, comment your thoughts or a prayer for those in need, and subscribe to the channel for more stories of hope. May God bless you and your family, protect the wrongly accused, strengthen single mothers, keep soldiers safe on distant borders, and guide every searching heart toward the light. Amen.